This is a great story. The Voice Before the Void.net. A Deal in Wheat by Frank Norris. Read by The Voice Before the Void. 1. The Bear. Wheat at 62. As Sam Lewiston backed the horse into the shafts of his buckboard and began hitching the tugs to the whiffletree, his wife came out from the kitchen door of the house and drew near, and stood for some time at the horse's head, her arms folded and her apron rolled around them. For a long moment neither spoke. They had talked over the situation so long and so comprehensively the night before that there seemed to be nothing more to say. The time was late in the summer. The place, a ranch in southwestern Kansas. And Lewiston and his wife were two of a vast population of farmers, wheat growers, who at that moment were passing through a crisis that at any moment might culminate in tragedy. Wheat was down to 66. At length, Emma Lewiston spoke. "Well," she hazarded, looking vaguely out across the ranch toward the horizon, leagues distant. "Well, Sam, there's always that offer of Brother Joe's. We can quit and go to Chicago, if the worst comes." "And give up?" exclaimed Lewiston, running the lines through the torrents. "Leave the ranch? Give up? After all these years?" His wife made no reply for the moment. Lewiston climbed into the buckboard and gathered up the lines. "Well, here goes for the last try, Emmy," he said. "Goodbye, girl. Maybe things will look better in town today." "Maybe," she said gravely. She kissed her husband goodbye and stood for some time looking after the buckboard traveling toward the town in a moving pillar of dust. "I don't know," she murmured at length. "I don't know just how we're going to make out." When he reached town, Lewiston tied the horse to the iron railing in front of the Oddfellows' Hall, the ground floor of which was occupied by the post office, and went across the street and up the stairway of a building of brick and granite, quite the most pretentious structure of the town, and knocked at a door upon the first landing. The door was furnished with a pane of frosted glass, on which, in gold letters, was inscribed, "Bridges and Company, Grain Dealers." Bridges himself, a middle-aged man who wore a velvet skullcap and who was smoking a Pittsburgh stogie, met the farmer at the counter, and the two exchanged perfunctory greetings. "Well," said Lewiston, tentatively, after a while. "Well, Lewiston," said the other, "I can't take that wheat of yours at any better than 62. 62. It's the Chicago price that does it, Lewiston. Truslow is bearing the stuff for all he's worth. It's Truslow and the Bear Clique that stick the knife into us. The price broke again this morning. We've just got a wire." "Good heavens," murmured Lewiston, looking vaguely from side to side. That ruins me. I can't carry my grain any longer. What with storage charges and bridges, I don't see how I'm going to make out. 62 cents a bushel? Why, man, what with this and with that, it cost me nearly $1 a bushel to raise that wheat. And now Truslow. He turned away abruptly with a quick gesture of infinite discouragement. He went down the stairs, and making his way to where his buckboard was hitched, got in, and, with eyes vacant, the reins slipping and sliding in his limp, half-open hands, drove slowly back to the ranch. His wife had seen him coming, and met him as he drew up before the barn. "Well?" she demanded. "Emmy," he said as he got out of the buckboard, laying his arm across her shoulder. "Emmy, I guess we'll take up with Joe's offer. We'll go to Chicago. We're cleaned out." 2. The Bull. Wheat at $1.10. And said party of the second part further covenants and agrees to merchandise such wheat in foreign parts, it being understood and agreed between the party of the first part and the party of the second part that the wheat hereinbefore mentioned is released and sold to the party of the second part for export purposes only, and not for consumption or distribution within the boundaries of the United States of America or of Canada. "Now, Mr. Gates, if you will sign for Mr. Truslow, I guess that'll be all," remarked Hornig when he had finished reading. Hornig affixed his signature to the 2 documents and passed them over to Gates, who signed for his principal and client, Truslow, or as he had been called ever since he had gone into the fight against Hornig's Corner, the Great Bear. Hornig's secretary was called in and witnessed the signatures, and Gates thrust the contract into his Gladstone bag and stood up, smoothing his hat. "You will deliver the warehouse receipts for the grain," began Gates. "I'll send a messenger to Truslow's office before noon," interrupted Hornig. "You can pay by certified check through the Illinois Trust people." When the other had taken himself off, Hornig sat for some moments gazing abstractedly toward his office windows, thinking over the whole matter. He had just agreed to release to Truslow, at the rate of $1.10 per bushel, 100,000 out of the 2,000,000 and odd bushels of wheat that he, Hornig, controlled or actually owned. And for the moment he was wondering if, after all, he had done wisely in not goring the Great Bear to actual financial death. He had made him pay $100,000. Truslow was good for this amount. Would it not have been better to have put a prohibitive figure on the grain and forced the bear into bankruptcy? True, Hornig would then be without his enemy's money, but Truslow would have been eliminated from the situation, and that, so Hornig told himself, was always a consummation most devoutly, strenuously, and diligently to be striven for. Truslow, once dead, was dead, but the bear was never more dangerous than when desperate. "But so long as he can't get wheat," muttered Hornig at the end of his reflections, "he can't hurt me. And he can't get it. That I know." For Hornig controlled the situation. So far back as the February of that year, an unknown bull had been making his presence felt on the floor of the Board of Trade. By the middle of March, the commercial reports of the daily press had begun to speak of the powerful bull clique. A few weeks later, that legendary condition of affairs implied and epitomized in the magic words "dollar wheat" had been attained, and by the 1st of April, when the price had been boosted to $1.10 a bushel, Hornig had disclosed his hand, and in place of mere rumors, the definite and authoritative news that May wheat had been cornered in the Chicago pit went flashing around the world from Liverpool to Odessa and from Duluth to Buenos Aires. It was, so the veteran operators were persuaded, Truslow himself who had made Hornig's corner possible. The Great Bear had for once overreached himself, and, believing himself all-powerful, had hammered the price just the fatal fraction too far down. Wheat had gone to 62. For the time, and under the circumstances, an abnormal price. When the reaction came, it was tremendous. Hornig saw his chance, seized it, and in a few months had turned the tables, had cornered the product, and virtually driven the bear clique out of the pit. On the same day that the delivery of the 100,000 bushels was made to Truslow, Hornig met his broker at his lunch club. "Well," said the latter, "I see you let go that line of stuff to Truslow." Hornig nodded, but the broker added, "Remember, I was against it from the very beginning. I know we've cleared up over 100,000. I would have 50 times preferred to have lost twice that and smashed Truslow dead. Bet you what you like, he makes us pay for it somehow." Huh, grunted his principal. How about insurance, and warehouse charges, and carrying expenses on that lot? Guess we'd have had to pay those too if we'd held on. But the other put up his chin, unwilling to be persuaded. I won't sleep easy, he declared, till Truslow is busted. 3. The Pit. Just as Going mounted the steps on the edge of the pit, the great gong struck. A roar of 100 voices developed with the swiftness of successive explosions. The rush of 100 men surging downward to the center of the pit filled the air with the stamp and grind of feet. 100 hands in eager, strenuous gestures tossed upward from out the brown of the crowd. The official reporter in his cage on the margin of the pit leaned far forward with straining ear to catch the opening bid, and another day of battle was begun. Since the sale of the 100,000 bushels of wheat to Truslow, the Hornig crowd had steadily shouldered the price higher, until on this particular morning it stood at $1.50. That was Hornig's price. No one else had any grain to sell. But not 10 minutes after the opening, Going was surprised out of all countenance to hear shouted from the other side of the pit these words: "Sell May at $1.50. Going was for the moment touching elbows with Kimbark on one side and Merriam on the other, all three belonging to the Hornig crowd. Their answering challenge of "sold" was as the voice of one man. They did not pause to reflect upon the strangeness of the circumstance. That was for afterward. Their response to the offer was as unconscious, as reflex action, and almost as rapid. And before the pit was well aware of what had happened, the transaction of 1,000 bushels was down upon Going's trading card, and $1,500 had changed hands. But here was a marvel. The whole available supply of wheat cornered, Hornig master of the situation, invincible, unassailable, yet behold a man willing to sell. A bear bold enough to raise his head. "That was Kennedy, wasn't it, who made that offer?" asked Kimbark, as Going noted down the trade. "Kennedy, that new man." "Yes. Who do you suppose he's selling for? Who's willing to go short at this stage of the game?" "Maybe he ain't short." "Short? Great heavens, man, where'd he get the stuff?" "Blamed if I know. We can account for every handful of May. Steady. Oh, there he goes again." "Sell 1,000 May at $1.50, vociferated the bear broker, throwing out his hand, one finger raised to indicate the number of contracts offered. This time it was evident that he was attacking the Hornig crowd deliberately, for, ignoring the jam of traders that swept toward him, he looked across the pit to where Going and Kimbark were shouting, "Sold! Sold!" and nodded his head. A second time Going made memoranda of the trade, and either the Hornig holdings were increased by 2,000 bushels of May wheat, or the Hornig bank account swelled by at least $3,000 of some unknown short's money. Of late, so sure was the bull crowd of its position, no one had even thought of glancing at the inspection sheet on the bulletin board. But now one of Going's messengers hurried up to him with the announcement that this sheet showed receipts at Chicago for that morning of 25,000 bushels, and not credited to Hornig. Someone had got hold of a line of wheat overlooked by the clique, and was dumping it upon them. "Wire the chief," said Going over his shoulder to Merriam. This one struggled out of the crowd, and on a telegraph blank scribbled, "Strong bear movement. New man. Kennedy. Selling in lots of 5 contracts. Chicago receipts, 25,000. The message was dispatched, and in a few moments the answer came back, laconic, of military terseness. "Support the market." And Going obeyed, Merriam and Kimbark following, the new broker fairly throwing the wheat at them in 1,000-bushel lots. "Sell May at 50. Sell May. Sell May." A moment's indecision, an instant's hesitation, the first faint suggestion of weakness, and the market would have broken under them. But for the better part of 4 hours they stood their ground, taking all that was offered, in constant communication with the chief, and from time to time stimulated and steadied by his brief, unvarying command, "Support the market." At the close of the session, they had bought in the 25,000 bushels of May. Hornig's position was as stable as a rock, and the price closed even with the opening figure, $1.50. But the morning's work was the talk of all LaSalle Street. Who was back of the raid? What was the meaning of this unexpected selling? For weeks the pit trading had been merely nominal. Truslow, the great bear, from whom the most serious attack might have been expected, had gone to his country seat at Geneva Lake, in Wisconsin, declaring himself to be out of the market entirely. He went bass fishing every day. 4. The Belt Line. On a certain day toward the middle of the month, at a time when the mysterious bear had unloaded some 80,000 bushels upon Hornig, a conference was held in the library of Hornig's home. His broker attended it, and also a clean-faced, bright-eyed individual whose name of Cyrus Ryder might have been found upon the payroll of a rather well-known detective agency. For upward of half an hour after the conference began, the detective spoke, the other two listening attentively, gravely. "Then, last of all," concluded Ryder, "I made out I was a hobo, and began stealing rides on the Beltline Railroad. Know the road? It just circles Chicago. Truslow owns it. Yes? Well, then I began to catch on. I noticed that cars of certain numbers, 31-034, 32-190, well, the numbers don't matter, but anyhow, these cars were always switched onto the sidings by Mr. Truslow's main elevator D soon as they came in. The wheat was shunted in, and they were pulled out again. Well, I spotted one car and stole a ride on her. Say, look here. That car went right around the city on the belt and came back to D again, and the same wheat in her all the time. The grain was re-inspected. It was raw, I tell you, and the warehouse receipts made out just as though the stuff had come in from Kansas or Iowa." "The same wheat all the time," interrupted Hornig. "The same wheat, your wheat, that you sold to Truslow." "Great snakes," spit Hornig's broker. "Truslow never took it abroad at all." "Took it abroad? Say, he's just been running it around Chicago, like the supers in Shenandoah, round and round, so you'd think it was a new lot, and selling it back to you again." "No wonder we couldn't account for so much wheat." "Bought it from us at 110 and made us buy it back, our own wheat, at 150. Hornig and his broker looked at each other in silence for a moment. Then, all at once, Hornig struck the arm of his chair with his fist and exploded in a roar of laughter. The broker stared for one bewildered moment, then followed his example. "Sold! Sold!" shouted Hornig almost gleefully. "Upon my soul, it's as good as a Gilbert and Sullivan show. And oh, Lord, shake on it, and hats off to my distinguished friend, Truslow. He'll be president some day. Hey, what, prosecute him? Not I." "He's done us out of a neat hatful of dollars for all that," observed the broker, suddenly grave. "Billy, it's worth the price. We've got to make it up somehow. Well, tell you what, we were going to boost the price to $175 next week and make that our settlement figure. Can't do it now. Can't afford it. No. Here, we'll let out a big link. We'll put wheat at $2 and let it go at that." "Two it is, then," said the broker. 5. The Bread Line. The street was very dark and absolutely deserted. It was a district on the south side, not far from the Chicago River, given up largely to wholesale stores, and after nightfall was empty of all life. The echoes slept but lightly hereabouts, and the slightest footfall, the faintest noise, woke them upon the instant and sent them clamoring up and down the length of the pavement between the iron-shuttered fronts. The only light visible came from the side door of a certain Vienna bakery, where at 1 o'clock in the morning loaves of bread were given away to any who should ask. Every evening, about 9 o'clock, the outcasts began to gather about the side door. The stragglers came in rapidly, and the line, the bread line as it was called, began to form. By midnight it was usually some 100 yards in length, stretching almost the entire length of the block. Toward 10 in the evening, his coat collar turned up against the fine drizzle that pervaded the air, his hands in his pockets, his elbows gripping his sides, Sam Lewiston came up and silently took his place at the end of the line. Unable to conduct his farm upon a paying basis at the time when Truslow, the great bear, had sent the price of grain down to 62 cents a bushel, Lewiston had turned over his entire property to his creditors and, leaving Kansas for good, had abandoned farming, and had left his wife at her sister's boarding house in Topeka with the understanding that she was to join him in Chicago as soon as he had found a steady job. Then he had come to Chicago and had turned workman. His brother Joe conducted a small hat factory on Archer Avenue, and for a time he found there a meager employment. But difficulties had occurred, times were bad, and the hat factory was involved in debts. The repealing of a certain import duty on manufactured felt overcrowded the home market with cheap Belgian and French products, and in the end his brother had assigned and gone to Milwaukee. Thrown out of work, Lewiston drifted aimlessly about Chicago, from pillar to post, working a little, earning here $1, there a dime, but always sinking, till at last the ooze of the lowest bottom dragged at his feet, and the rush of the great ebb went over him and engulfed him and shut him out from the light, and a park bench became his home, and the bread line his chief makeshift of substance. He stood now in the enfolding drizzle, sodden, stupefied with fatigue. Before and behind stretched the line. There was no talking. There was no sound. The street was empty. It was so still that the passing of a cable car in the adjoining thoroughfare grated like prolonged rolling explosions, beginning and ending at immeasurable distances. The drizzle descended incessantly. After a long time, midnight struck. There was something ominous and gravely impressive in this interminable line of dark figures, close pressed, soundless. A crowd, yet absolutely still. A close-packed, silent file, waiting in the vast, deserted, night-ridden street. Waiting without a word, without a movement. There under the night and under the slow-moving mists of rain. Few in the crowd were professional beggars. Most of them were workmen, long since out of work, forced into idleness by long-continued hard times, by ill luck, by sickness. To them, the bread line was a godsend. At least they could not starve. Between jobs here in the end was something to hold them up, a small platform, as it were, above the sweep of black water, where for a moment they might pause and take breath before the plunge. The period of waiting on this night of rain seemed endless to those silent, hungry men. But at length there was a stir. The line moved. The side door opened. Ah, at last! They were going to hand out the bread. But instead of the usual white-aproned undercook with his crowded hampers, There now appeared in the doorway a new man, a young fellow who looked like a bookkeeper's assistant. He bore in his hand a placard, which he tacked to the outside of the door. Then he disappeared within the bakery, locking the door after him. A shudder of poignant despair, an unformed, inarticulate sense of calamity, seemed to run from end to end of the line. What had happened? Those in the rear, unable to read the placard, surged forward, a sense of bitter disappointment clutching at their hearts. The line broke up, disintegrated into a shapeless throng. A throng that crowded forward and collected in front of the shut door whereon the placard was affixed. Lewiston, with the others, pushed forward. On the placard he read these words: "Owing to the fact that the price of grain has been increased to $2 a bushel, there will be no distribution of bread from this bakery until further notice." Lewiston turned away, dumb, bewildered. Till morning he walked the streets, going on without purpose, without direction.